Now, before we go any further, let's talk about the Triarchy, because I guarantee some viewers were watching this battle thinking, wait, who are these people again? The Triarchy is an alliance between three powerful free cities across the Narrow Sea, Lys, Mare, and Tyrosh. They're not part of Westeros, they don't answer to the Iron Throne, and that's exactly what makes them so dangerous. Unlike the great houses choosing sides between the Greens and the Blacks, the Triarchy operates according to its own interests. They aren't fighting because they care who sits on the Iron Throne. They're fighting because war creates opportunity. If they can weaken House Velaryon, disrupt trade, and expand their own influence across the Narrow Sea, then they stand to gain regardless of who wins the Civil War. And if the name sounds familiar, that's because we've seen these people before. Back in Season 1, Daemon Targaryen and Corlys Velaryon spent years fighting the Triarchy in the Stepstones. This was the war that introduced us to the Crabfeeder and helped establish Daemon's reputation as one of the most feared warriors in Westeros. Thousands of Triarchy soldiers and pirates died during that conflict, and House of the Dragon makes it very clear that not everyone has forgotten. That's why the Battle of the Gullet feels so personal. For Shirako Lohar, this isn't simply another military operation. This is revenge. Corlys Velaryon spent years destroying Triarchy fleets, killing Triarchy soldiers, and crushing their influence in the Stepstones. The scars of that war are still there, and Episode 1 reminds us that old enemies never truly disappear in Westeros. What's interesting is that while the Triarchy arrive as allies of the Greens, they're really a wild card. They're not loyal to Aegon. They're not loyal to Aemond. They're not loyal to Alicent. They're loyal to themselves. And that's what makes them such a fascinating faction. The moment they enter the story, the conflict becomes bigger than a simple Targaryen civil war. Suddenly, outside powers are getting involved. Foreign fleets are crossing the sea. Old grudges are resurfacing. The Dance of the Dragons is no longer just a family dispute. It's becoming an international conflict, with consequences far beyond King's Landing. Ironically, the Battle of the Gullet may also mark the beginning of the end for the Triarchy itself. In George R.R. Martin's lore, the aftermath of this battle creates distrust between Lys, Mare, and Tyrosh, eventually contributing to the collapse of the alliance. So while the Triarchy arrives hoping to reshape the future of Westeros, they may have just accelerated their own downfall as well. And honestly, that's one of the recurring themes of House of the Dragon. Everyone enters these battles believing they're shaping history. What they don't realize is that history is shaping them too. Now, once you understand who the Triarchy are and why they're here, the Battle of the Gullet starts to feel less like a random clash and more like a settling of old debts. This isn't just about the Greens versus the Blacks anymore. This is about history catching up with people who thought those wars were already behind them. From the moment the battle fully ignites, the episode does something very deliberate. It splits the chaos into layers. On the surface, you've got ships burning, arrows raining down, dragons tearing through formations. But underneath that, there's a very controlled structure to how Corlys is trying to manage everything. His strategy isn't reckless, it's calculated. He's trying to funnel the Triarchy fleet into positions where Dragonfire can do the most damage while minimizing exposure to his own ships. And for a brief period, it actually works. That's what makes this battle so tense. You keep getting moments where it feels like the Blacks have it under control. The Triarchy fleet is getting broken apart, communication between their ships starts collapsing, and Baela and Moondancer are carving through the battlefield with precision. It almost feels like a replay of history, where Corlys is once again proving why he's called the Sea Snake. Every move he makes has intent behind it. Every reaction feels measured. But war in House of the Dragon never stays clean for long. The turning point isn't one big explosion or one dramatic betrayal. It's fragmentation. The battlefield stops behaving like a single coordinated event and starts breaking into smaller, uncontrollable incidents. Ships drift out of formation. Dragons become separated from their intended targets. Commanders lose sight of what's happening beyond their immediate surroundings. And once that happens, strategy stops mattering in the same way. This is where the episode quietly starts shifting focus toward Jace. At first, he's still acting in line with the plan. He's supporting the larger strategy, engaging where needed, staying aware of the battlefield. But the further the battle progresses, the more personal everything becomes. And that's important, because Jace is not a character who thrives in chaos. He thrives in structure. He thrives in purpose. And the Gullet gives him neither. Then Rhaena appears on Sheepstealer. And everything breaks because from a distance, there is no way to interpret what's happening correctly. A wild dragon enters the battlefield. It attacks indiscriminately, it burns both sides, and in the middle of that chaos, Vermax is engaged. To everyone watching from below, or even from nearby ships, it doesn't look like confusion. It looks like betrayal or aggression from an unknown rider. This is where House of the Dragon does something very clever with perspective. We as viewers know it's Rhaena. The characters don't, so the battlefield becomes a mismatch of truth and perception. And in war, perception is often more powerful than reality. Jace's fatal moment comes not from arrogance but recognition. He sees the rider. He realizes who it is. And in that split second, the entire rhythm of the battle changes for him. Because now this is no longer just strategy, it's family. And that decision to hesitate, to pull back, to avoid striking Rhaena and Sheepstealer is what opens the door for everything that follows. Vermax becomes vulnerable. The formation breaks. The enemy seizes the opening. And Jace ends up separated from the only protection he had left in that moment. What follows isn't a heroic last stand. It's a collapse. He falls into the water. The battlefield continues above him. Ships are still burning. Dragons are still circling. And for a moment, the war doesn't even notice that the heir to Rhaenyra Targaryen has disappeared beneath the waves. That detail matters more than anything else, because House of the Dragon is constantly reminding us that war doesn't pause for tragedy, it doesn't slow down for grief, it just keeps moving forward. And when Jace dies, the battle doesn't end, it escalates. The Blacks still technically win the engagement, the Triarchy fleet is destroyed, the blockade holds. Corlys achieves his objective. But the cost is so disproportionate that victory becomes almost meaningless in emotional terms. And that's where the episode quietly shifts from military storytelling into political consequences. Because now Rhaenyra doesn't just have to think about strategy. She has to think about loss. And loss changes everything in this story. It changes decisions, it changes alliances, it changes people. And in the case of the Dance of the Dragons, it almost always leads to worse outcomes than the original conflict ever did. What makes Jace's death even more impactful is the timing. Because if you zoom out for a second, this happens right when Rhaenyra is at her closest point to victory. The path to King's Landing is opening, Aemond is distracted, alliances are holding, and for the first time in a long time, everything feels like it's aligning in her favor. But the show deliberately drops this loss right in the middle of that momentum. It doesn't let victory breathe, it interrupts it. And that completely changes the emotional direction of the season going forward. And that's why episode 1 doesn't feel like a beginning in the traditional sense. It feels like a turning point that forces every character into a different version of themselves. Rhaenyra is no longer just planning a conquest. She's now carrying grief into every decision she makes. The Greens are no longer just an opposing faction. They've now triggered a consequence they may not fully understand yet. And the war itself stops feeling like a contest of strategy and starts feeling like something much more personal, unstable, and unpredictable. And what makes the Triarchy so important in all of this is not just what they are, but when they arrive. Because timing in House of the Dragon is never accidental. This isn't a random pirate fleet showing up to cause chaos. This is a coordinated move at one of the most fragile moments in the entire war. The Blacks are stretched thin, the Greens are dealing with internal instability, and suddenly, a foreign power enters the board with its own agenda, its own history, and absolutely no loyalty to either side. That's why Jace Velaryon is forced into such a difficult position during the Battle of the Gullet. Because for him, this isn't just another naval engagement. This is personal history coming back to life in the worst possible way. The Triarchy isn't just attacking his fleet, they're reminding him that the Stepstones war never really ended. It just paused long enough for everyone to pretend it was over. And now, all those consequences are sailing straight back into his world. And the deeper you look at it, the clearer it becomes that the Triarchy represents something bigger than just pirates or mercenaries. They represent what happens when Westeros, internal wars, stop being internal. Once outside forces realize how unstable the realm has become, they don't need to pick a side for ideology, they pick a side for advantage. And in the case of the Gullet, that advantage is chaos. Because chaos is the one thing every faction can profit from, even if they don't survive it.